What is up, everybody? How are you doing? Adrian M. Gibson here. Here we are on day 6 of TBRCon 2023, winding down the day with a couple of author readings. And right now I am joined by none other than Emma Mieko Candon. How are you?
Hi, I'm great. Apologies in advance. I don't think I mentioned. If you hear knocking, they tore the roof off of the house directly across the street from us, and they are putting the roof back on today. So
Oh,
great. Love that for them. But if you
just
hear a noise,
some
that's
Hawaiian
them.
ambiance. That's what
Yeah.
we got there. It's all good, but it's really good to see you again. So Emma was on episode 32 of SFF Addicts talking about robots and AI. And today she's going to be doing a reading from her next book, which is The Archive Undying, which is such a beautiful looking cover. And for folks who don't know you personally, can you tell them a bit about yourself?
So hi, yeah, I am an author. This is going to be my debut original book because my actual debut book was Star Wars Ronin, which was extrapolated from the very first episode of Star Wars Visions, The Duel, which was this sort of Kurosawa homage to which integrated like Star Wars lightsaber duels and Sith aesthetics with this very Kurosawa tale of a Ronin coming into a village, hunting down another Sith who had turned to banditry. Uh, and I got to extrapolate that into a whole novel where I spent a lot of time working through a lot of my feelings about Star Wars, which I have a lot of because I was enchanted by it at age like 7, and now I'm in my 30s. So it's been a while. But it was also just such a gift to be able to talk about it through the lens of Japanese history and also Japanese art and the way it's used certain historical lenses to examine questions of war and personal responsibility and loyalty to oneself and to others. So yeah, it was great. I really enjoyed getting to do that with Star Wars, but now I have my own thing going on, and generally I'll be writing more of these original works.
Yeah.
And yeah, I call myself an escaped academic because I'm a huge nerd about the sort of meta kinds of things. And
Yeah.
I was doing my master's in psychology when I had to move back home to do major surgery because of health problems. And now I work remotely, but I'm still a huge nerd.
And now you get to write about giant robots and
Yes.
artificial intelligence and stuff like that. Why don't you tell
Yeah.
people a bit more about the Archive Undying?
Okay, so I always have a really tough time explaining this book because I'm very concept forward. And so I'll start by saying it actually, like, the seeds were fermenting during my psychology master's because I was starting to get really annoyed with a particular kind of capitalist AI doomsday mythology that was positing these AIs that would one day grow to no longer require us, or there would be like the singularity. And it
Right.
was always very algorithmic, and it was always this very like predatory imperialist point of view for what a highly sophisticated AI would look like, and one that's very annoying both to people who are doing any kind of brain science and to people who are doing any kind of computer science, because that's not how this works. It's not how any of this works. And you'll hear a lot of us complaining about that on that AI episode.
Yeah.
So instead, what I wanted to write was something that was deeply rooted in the idea of an artificial intelligence that had been created by humanity, but that was primarily informed by principles of how the brain actually works, which is fundamentally very embodied and very emotive. So that was part of it. Part of it was also me like having watched Pacific Rim when I came out of like my major health crisis, and my brain was like changed forever by that.
Giant robots.
And I was also at the time listening to Friends at the Table and their Counterweight season that pulled me through a lot of my recovery. And they do these divine AIs and stuff with artificial intelligence where they just start from the assumption of personhood and then move forward. I'm like, yes, that's where I want to be. And I think the final thing that was in the mix of this was probably watching Rogue One and finally feeling like there was a Star Wars that I really resonated with as an adult. So all those things came together to create the Archive Undying. And I think knowing those going in will be very unsurprising to anyone who reads it.
I love it. Rogue One was my favorite Star Wars movie ever.
Yeah, it just...
I think ever at this point. Yeah.
It hit me really in this fascinating way. And part of it, I think, was seeing East Asian characters on the screen for the first time. That was like, I talk sometimes about how that was what made me like physically understand the idea of representation. Because I sort of given it lip service before, like, of course that's a good thing. Yeah, everyone deserves to be represented. But watching Chirrut and Baze on screen was actually like a physical moment for me. Like I started, I think, crying in my seat, and I was like, there's no reason for this other than the visuals I am receiving and what they're triggering in my brain. But also just like the kind of story it was. And we've been getting that, but even more with Andor as this television series. I'm obsessed with it. It's so good. It was like a Star Wars that was almost grappling with itself and the kind of thing it is. So yeah, that was, oh God, funny story. I started writing Archive, and like in the back of my brain was, write this so that they will one day allow you to write a Star Wars book.
And then you published your Star Wars book before the Archive Undying.
Reading the prologue and the first couple chapters, some of which I will be reading today, was what convinced the Star Wars team to give me the opportunity to write Ronin.
Nice.
So it worked.
That's what it's all about.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, on that note, you mentioned that you'll be reading from the Archive Undying. Which section will you be reading, and why is that the section you chose to showcase this book?
So I'm starting from the very first page, and it's a section that I guess is a prologue, kind of. It's so I'll be reading that, and then like the first page or so of chapter 1.
Okay.
But this section that I'm reading, it's not the only one like that in the book. The book is a little bit weird. I've I think firmed up a lot in my writing since then. Like my brain has almost warped to be a little more traditional in some ways in terms of structure. But there's some experimental elements of this book, and it's the opening scene. It's what got both my editors interested in my work. So I feel like it's the thing to start on, right?
Perfect. Well, Emma, I will let you take it away.
Okay, let's go. The Archive Undying by Emma Mieko Candon. A memory you could call the first. You are alone when you die. The autonomous intelligence Iterate Fractal has corrupted, and it is dying. And in its divine death, it has killed you. You and thousands more across Kuanmo, the island city-state of which Iterate Fractal was patron and protector. Thousands of citizens who are crushed by living bone and pierced by twisting coral, who are torn apart by maddened ten beasts, who are screaming, crying, and who one by one grows silent. All but you, Sunai, you who linger, pinned through the rib cage to iterate Fractal's central shrine on the Isle of Lotus. You who came in supplication to the white-lit banyan that was the heart of my neurotransitive network. You who knelt at my archive to await your death. You, not yet alone, because I am with you. As if I forgot. You croak. You clutch the root in your breast. It is the largest of the veins iterate fractal stuck into you, and the least intentional. You were interfaced when corruption hit. Your arms and legs and throat riddled with finer threads, all white and tender, the dendritic web through which you understood iterate fractal meant to finally consume you. In the darkening hollow of the city's heart, they gleam with shallow light. When they first whirled through your pores and rooted in your palms, they shone through your skin and made you verdant. Now the filaments flicker, their pulse uneven. You're too hurt to feel them writhing. The shock keeps your agony at bay. Your skull thunks against ivory rubble. Your breath is ragged, and your body seeps warmth, coming up on a proper death. If iterate fractal means to eat you, it had better hurry its shit up. You gasp, your bitterness a clarifying note in the muck of your bleeding thoughts. Iterate fractal was dying, as were you, but this truth is a distant one. By now you are already quite dead, and you have been for 17 years. 17 years. You have been dead for 17 years. None of this is real. Some rude hiccup of neural trauma has drowned you in this recollection. Fun. I'm not doing this again, you whisper. I'm not. The decision is made with the saying of it. You push, pull, push, rock and ease and shove, claw your way up the ruddy length of root until it pops out your back and you fall forward on your hands, panting high and tight, afraid of the pain that would come with deep breath. This isn't what happened. You never did free yourself. There had to be an easier way to do that, I say. You raise your head. Dizzied by the movement, you must lie on your side. From this skewed vantage, you watch my impossible approach across the darkened roots of the corrupted shrine. It is difficult to understand what you see. A body, narrow in frame and young of face, at once familiar and alien. It bears your frame, wears your face, and these you know well enough, but how can you be picking across the ruins of the shrine when you are also prone and bleeding on its floor? I am what kneels before you. I am what cradles your cheek. I am what brings you succor in the hour of our death in my shrine, my archive, my home that I shared with you. I and you and we. You close your eyes, but you can't forget what you have seen, even as you are sure in some churning, distant part of your brain that you cannot have seen it. I can tell you what you're thinking in that far, unreachable part of you. That memory is bullshit anyway, and whatever it is your mind is doing now, it's merely the collapsed synthesis of a multitude of errant thoughts. You died so long ago. This vision is terrible, but fleeting. It is much worse than that, my whole, my Sunai. I have always been with you. I have always been you. And though this is true, it is and will always be. I don't expect your hand at my throat. You seize me by the gullet and drag me close. Your every movement is sweep after sweep of encompassing pain, but you have stunned me, and that satisfies. Where am I? You hiss into the face that is yours, mine, ours. What's happening to me? I lean into your grasp. I touch my mouth to my mouth, our mouths together. I say I, and I, and I. Chapter 1. The letter catches up to Sunai in Gamor, where it's always a little too cold not to hate having fingers. It comes by way of the auntie who runs the shabby hostel where he stows his ruck between jobs. She says the kid who dropped it off had Sunai's description: middling short, bespectacled, faint limp, long braid, old eyeliner. The envelope isn't signed, but for a scrawl across the seam. The sigil of Leaf 36, Cascade. A short poem at the end of the lay about a rain shower that becomes a waterfall that drowns a rice field and starves a village, and eons later becomes a sea. You know, consequences. The symbolism needn't be so obvious. Sunai hasn't led a life that invites people to write him, let alone figure out which city-state in all the wilds they should send their letters to. Only one person would go to the trouble. He must still be nursing the delusion that Sunai will one day try another way of living. Perhaps a way involving fewer professional near-death experiences, or less ill-considered sex with unscrupulous acquaintances. Ideally, a way of life that would begin with a long, agonized reckoning with his shoddy excuse for a brain. Joke's on him. Sunai isn't really alive. Yet there he perches on the edge of a thin mattress in his usual hostel room, thumb running down and up and down the sealed envelope seam. His ruck sits heavy between his booted heels, still dirty from his most recent trek across the wilds. He never stays long between jobs, just long enough to drink himself insensible and piss off another pretty man. His need to get the hell out of town has gone from pressing to urgent. If a letter can find him, so can its sender. And that's it.
Excellent stuff. Really, really good. Seriously.
Hooray!
Yeah, I'm just blown away not only by the really, really cool and powerful language, but also your delivery. Your delivery was very good.
Thank
It's like
you.
you got super into it. I love it.
Yeah, I used to do like actual performances. I also sang
Oh,
in
cool.
choirs, but part of my illness kind of, well, one, I have 50% lung capacity, but also I think it's generally audibly very evident that I was, what's the word? I had a tracheotomy. I had a thing in my throat for about 5 months.
Oh, wow.
So, every once in a while I consider going to a vocal coach to be like, what can I do with what I've got? But it's in my bones, but not generally a thing I do anymore. So thank you. I really appreciate
No,
that.
no, no. You put a lot into it. And I really appreciate that. And just from the opening, it was very for me, it was very engrossing. I want to ask you a question about perspective and
Mm,
tense.
mm,
Second person is a
yes.
very interesting tense that a lot of people are iffy on. I personally love it.
Uh-huh.
The author who sold me on it was Jeff Vandermeer in
Mm.
the second book of the Southern Reach trilogy, which
Uh-huh.
was Authority.
Yeah.
And to me, it's a very involving and very intimate tense.
Mhm.
But I'm curious for you, when you were writing this book and you started off with that prologue and using a mix of tenses,
Mhm.
but also specifically second person.
Mhm.
What went into that choice, and how do you feel about that particular tense?
So, uh, the interesting thing about this prologue is that it was not the first thing I wrote for this book, not by a
Mm,
long shot.
okay.
Um, and so choosing second person for these kinds of narration uh, happened really organically. I wasn't really thinking about it when I did it, but it's very purposeful. Now, the way tense changes in Archive, it will tell you things about like who is speaking and what kind of entity they are. Like
Mm,
the implication is pretty clear. The thing that is speaking to you is not human. The
yep.
thing that is speaking to our protagonist, Sunai, is not him as such,
Mhm,
but there's a blurring of identity, and it begins with leveraging second person to do
mhm,
all the special things it can do that you can't actually achieve in other tenses,
yep.
because that blurring of identity and autonomy and power is one extremely interesting to me, and two really appropriate for the kinds of things I was interested in exploring with this book.
Mhm. And on that
So
notion of
yeah.
identity, how did you, bring things like, um, artificial intelligence and, robots and things like that into this conversation about things like identity and consciousness, or beings that are conscious enough of themselves that they can start to define themselves?
I think identity is like this really philosophically expansive and complex thing. And I certainly started drowning in it as an idea in undergrad, which I think is what drew me to the social sciences, because it was just a much more embodied and physical and tangible way of addressing that entire scope of idea.
Right.
So for me, with this book, identity is very closely married to embodiment.
Mm,
And that's really the root of all things in a way that doesn't necessarily get fully clarified until toward the end of it. But if you know that going in, I'm curious to see how that would shape someone's approach to the whole story.
mm,
One interesting tidbit. So I got very, very sick in 2012, like hospitalized for like 6 months. Uh, but I don't always explain that, because it's not like the defining thing looming over my life anymore.
mhm.
But
Yeah.
for a while, it very clearly was, because people would be like, this is a young person who is completely decrepit. What happened here? And, they'd ask rudely or they'd ask politely, but I'm a very open person. So I
Mhm.
just sort of like would go off on the spiel. I didn't tell my writing group locally about it until like fairly recently, and one of them had already read Archive, and she like gave me this look like, huh. I'm understanding something new about this book, and I'm like, yes, it is a book about recovery. I did not know that while I was writing it.
Mhm.
um, but it's so much about the physical condition and feeling at war with your own flesh.
Mm,
um, and so those were the elements of identity that I was bringing into like the particular way I wanted to talk about artificial intelligence, because to me
mhm.
it's so defined by physicality.
Yeah, 'cause, it's almost like writing as therapy, right? Where
Yeah, I mean, like unconsciously,
yeah,
like
yeah.
I absolutely didn't know that was what I was doing, but like, every once in a while when I'm working with this the sequel, I go, oh, this is the grief stage.
That's amazing
Yeah.
though that you can kind of track this back through this book. And
Mhm.
um, at which point did you mentioned that the opening of this book was what got you the Star Wars contract to write Star Wars Ronin.
Uh-huh.
So how did you kind of juggle the two projects? And what was it like for you writing Star Wars as someone who had grown up with it and been immersed in it, and now you had this opportunity to put your own stamp on it?
Okay, so the scheduling was actually somewhat fortuitous because we had there were certain like revisions we wanted to do between the manuscript that was bought and the manuscript as it currently exists. So we had
Right.
like a time, and also it was bought in 2020 at the end of 2020 when the pandemic had completely demolished publishing schedules. So I was actually scheduled for 2023 right off the bat. So we had a really long lead time,
Oh, wow.
which meant that I was able to take a break to go write Ronin. It was just like good timing because those deals happened a month apart from each other.
Mhm.
And the other thing that happened right around then was that my editor went on paternity leave. So it was kind of just like, this fits, this works. And my agent knew I was a little crazy about Star Wars. So um, she knew I definitely wanted to do it. And it worked. It worked out. Getting to work on a Star Wars book was really interesting because it's such a unique story. Um, because it's an AU, right? It's an
Mhm.
alternate universe, to use like fanfic terminology. I don't actually really write fanfic. I've written one fanfic,
Mhm.
and
This is like commissioned fanfic.
yeah, it was commissioned fanfic, and so like, but it's also specifically an AU, so I had a
Mhm.
lot of freedom, and that was a really good fit for me because the one fanfic I wrote wasn't like a massive AU because that's just the way my brain works. um, but I got to pull so much about uh, Japanese history and I mentioned like the art that Japanese auteurs have made, like Kurosawa. Like it's such
Mhm.
a specific time period that he's making movies in, which is post-war, post-World War II Japan, which I had incidentally done a lot of reading on in undergrad. It was I have a fascination with because having like I'm fourth generation Japanese, so like my family's experience of being Japanese in not only America but in Hawaii during World
Mm.
War II
Yep.
means there's a lot of trauma behind closed doors. Um, and there's likewise a lot of trauma in Japan because of the events of World War II, where, you know, the Japanese Empire, which was Japan's terrible response to Western Empire. Like they're like,
Mhm.
we don't want to be colonized, so we're gonna colonize other people, and it will be
Exactly.
equally as bad.
Like,
um,
Russia, fuck you. China,
yeah,
fuck you.
and it's
Korea,
just
like,
it's
Philippines. Yeah.
it's disastrous. It's so
Yep.
cruel and violent, and then uh, terrible violence is committed upon Japan, and they get
Mhm.
colonized effectively anyway. And so what you see in Kurosawa and his brethren, they're often using these period pieces, these jidaigeki, to tell their stories. But it's so easy to read into it like this sort of existential crisis of what it means to be part of a nation, to be beholden to a higher power that wants you to like do violence in its name, and the way
Mhm.
that can come to conflict with your own sense of moral personhood. And that was what I brought to Ronin. And I also made it really queer because they let me get away with it. Yay.
I love that. And
Yeah.
do you hope or do you think that you will be writing more Star Wars in the future, or
I'm very open to it. And that is all I can say right now.
NDAs, people, NDAs.
Keep an eye out.
Uh,
It's very hard for me to say no to Star Wars in particular, just because it
mhm.
was such a foundational part of my brain as a kid.
Yeah. Well, I'm
Yeah.
looking forward to it, to reading the Archive Undying, to hopefully seeing more Star Wars from you, NDAs aside. And thank you again for doing this reading. It was fantastic. That book, once again, is the Archive Undying, which is out on June 27th through Tor.com Publishing. And Emma, which formats will this be available in when people are able to pick it up on day one?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me here. It's been
My
just an
pleasure.
absolutely wonderful time. I love talking to you every time.
Me too.
Like, check out Adrian's art behind him. Like, he did all that. It's amazing. um, but it'll be in hardcover and audiobook. I was just helping select the audiobook narrator, and
Nice.
ebook, which is how I read most things. So, yeah, that's day one.
Awesome. Well, I'm very much looking forward to it. You can also pick up right now Star Wars Ronin, which I highly recommend. And if you want to hear us nerding the fuck out about robots and AI and consciousness and all kinds of stuff, you can go check out episode 32 of SFF Addicts. And thank you all for tuning into this reading. Emma, thank you again for taking the time. I really appreciate it. And we got one more reading today on day 6. So stay tuned, everybody. And I hope you're enjoying TBRCon week. Thank you so much.
Yeah. See you.